I teach hundreds of people every time we go to a show how to take care of crested geckos. And so I thought it was finally time to put out my crested gecko care guide. So here we are today with Snowflake, and we're going to learn how to take care of crested geckos. The first thing that you need to know when taking care of your crested gecko is what enclosure you're going to put it in. And it really does depend on the size of your crested gecko. So if you've purchased a little baby, then you're going to want a little enclosure. I highly recommend these ugly 6 quart shoe boxes. So we always drill a hole in the front using a hole saw or a hole bit that goes on the drill, and then we put in these vents. These are sold for household venting purposes, and this makes sure that your bin has plenty of um, ventilation, especially if you've drilled or used a soldering iron to punch holes into your plastic. And it also gives an easy way to mist this enclosure, which helps here when we have hundreds of baby geckos. But it also makes an easy way for you to monitor whether or not your baby is eating and pooping, because you'll have paper towel on the bottom and decorations, and then it'll be easy to keep track of. And when your gecko is really little, then you can also this space is plenty of space for it to feel to have things to do, but also feel secure. If you don't want to use an ugly 6 quart bin, that is completely possible, like completely acceptable. And a 8 by 8 by 12 is good for a little tiny gecko, and then you can move them up into a 12 by 12 by 18. So the standard recommendation for an adult is 18 by 18 by 24 these days. And you can also use a 29-gallon fish tank and prop it up on its side. Because these geckos are arboreal, you do want it to be taller than wide. And I Heart Gecko sells a front door kit. So you can turn your 29-gallon fish tank into a beautiful gecko enclosure. If you don't want to spend the big bucks and get the 18 by 18 by 24 that's sold by ZooMed or the other enclosure companies. Once you have an enclosure to put your gecko in, you will want to consider what substrate you're going to use. The If you are quarantining your animal, which I highly recommend you do when you bring it home to make sure that you're checking for health and wellness issues, I highly recommend paper towel because it helps you keep track of waste and make sure that your animal is eating and pooping, and that the poop doesn't look like excessively weird. Gecko poop is a little bit weird anyway, but it's you can see it being consistent if you are watching on paper towel. Once you're past the quarantine stage, you can totally continue to use paper towel. It just has to be cleaned quite often. You can also use bioactive, which is my favorite way to go. But then you need a drainage layer underneath your substrate to have a proper bioactive enclosure. It makes a huge difference for keeping plants and for watering and keeping up your humidity. You can also use things like Eco Earth or Coco Core, um, and even a topsoil play sand mix. All of those things are acceptable substrates to put down underneath your gecko. Then you want to build out your enclosure so that you are considering the fact that your gecko likes to climb. So you'll want a lot of horizontal branches. You'll want cork bark and cork tubes because they like to hide in those. You want to give them quite a bit of cover, either with fake plants or real plants, and build out a mini ecosystem for them to live in. If you are doing bioactive, it actually functions as an ecosystem. If you aren't doing bioactive, then it would not necessarily function as an ecosystem, but it would have all of the things that they would find in nature. Interestingly enough, you can skip the fancy materials, and I'll actually be doing a video in the next couple of weeks on how to keep your reptile happy using things from the Dollar Tree and from recycling. Um, because really, you just need to make sure you're providing them with a secure place to be and the things to climb on. And that doesn't necessarily have to be fancy wood that you purchased at the expo, or cork tubes, or live plants. It can be anything that meets those needs. So once you have your enclosure all built out and ready for your gecko, you do need to consider the heating and the lighting. And for many reptiles, this is a complicated area because they have very specific heating and lighting requirements. So a bearded dragon has a high UVB needs and high heat needs. The leopard gecko has high heat needs and so forth. The really cool thing, and one of the reasons why I love crested geckos for beginner reptile keepers, is that they are kept at room temperature, or they can be kept at room temperature. If your house is 72 to 78 degrees, you live in a very comfortable place for that gecko. Now, that does not mean that they do not benefit from a heat gradient. So, all reptiles are going to benefit from having the ability to go into warmer zones or cooler zones, and providing a small heat lamp on your enclosure, one that does not heat it above 80 degrees, can be helpful. Obviously, if you're doing a plastic bin, you don't want to use a heat lamp because that would melt your bin, but you can use a small heat mat and accomplish the same thing. Make sure that you're using your heat sources on a thermostat, and that can be a very complicated part for new keepers. So I will be making a video about that in the coming days. Great reason to subscribe and stay tuned for additional information. And for UVB, crested geckos don't have to have it. We've kept them in captivity for a really long time, and they do just fine. And it's long been thought that the idea that nocturnal animals didn't need UVB in general. However, more and more research is suggesting that there are benefits that we aren't seeing for having UVB, and that could be for your crested gecko as well. If you do provide a UVB, you want to make sure that you do have plenty of cover so that your crested gecko can get away from the UVB light. And you want to make sure that it's a low UVB, so you're going to go for the 5.0 bulb instead of the 10.0 bulb. And you're going to want a linear one because those are healthier for your reptiles. And you're going to want to pay attention to your gecko's eyes. I have heard of people who have had geckos that did a lot of basking under the UVB who have had eye damage. So you want to be making sure that you're keeping an eye on your gecko, which you should be doing anyway. But I don't know if those people had enough cover and if that's why their gecko wasn't out of the UVB enough to not have eye damage or not, because they're just stories that I heard on the internet. So you do want to make sure that you are paying attention to your gecko and its health and wellness. So, in addition to heating and lighting causing some stir on the internet sometimes, the next thing that causes some stir is humidity. Humidity is super important for crested geckos because they come from a very humid area. So you want your humidity to be above 60% most of the time. And it gets complicated because you can't really give people blanket advice on how to accomplish that. If you are keeping them in totes, it's going to be your humidity is going to stay higher all the time naturally. And if you live in a more humid place, it's going to be more humid naturally. The people who live in Utah are going to have a harder time keeping higher humidity than the people who live in Myrtle Beach because of the natural humidity in the air. So misting is usually the recommended way to keep humidity high. Thick substrate can help too if you live in a particularly dry area so you can add moisture to the substrate so that it is evaporating into your enclosure. You don't want that humidity to stay super high all the time. So care guides will tell you that you want it between 60 and 80%. But if you're keeping it really high all the time, then it's going to grow mold and it's going to grow bacteria, which are bad for your animal. So you do want things to dry out. Now, if you have high enough humidity, you might not need to mist in order to maintain your humidity, but you do still want to mist occasionally because most crested geckos are going to drink water in the form of water droplets, and very few of them are going to drink out of a water bowl. And if you're not providing any water droplets, then your gecko could become dehydrated, and that would be really sad. I always recommend that you still keep a water bowl. Even if your crested gecko doesn't seem to drink from the water bowl, having that source of water available all the time does seem important. And you should be cleaning it regularly. The final care thing is the diet. And this is one of the reasons I really love crested geckos, because its diet is one of the easiest ones to maintain and still have a healthy gecko. The number one thing you can do is provide your gecko with a high quality, pre made Crested Gecko diet 3 times a week. So I highly recommend Pangea and Rapashi. There are some other brands, especially if you live in Europe, that are high quality brands, and even companies like Zoomed have improved their formula over the years, so it's not as bad as it used to be. So you're going to mix this with 1 part food and 2 parts water to create a smoothie like dish that you offer your Crested Gecko. And you can put it in there. I leave mine for 48 hours and then I remove it and replace it with fresh. And I feed them 3 times a week, and that is their primary food source. I highly recommend still feeding bugs because it is really good for their brains to interact with the bugs, and it's good for a protein source, especially as they're growing. However, not all crested geckos will eat bugs, and it can also be very stressful if you feel like you have to feed them bugs and then they won't eat them. So if your crested gecko isn't one that's not going to like that just refuses bugs, or if you have a really like horrible reason, like you just can't handle bugs but you still really want a crested gecko, then you can also feed crested gecko diet that has bugs incorporated by choosing things like the fig and insect, the fruit and grub, and growth and breeder mix. All of those have bugs incorporated into the mix. Whenever you are feeding insects to your crested gecko, you should be dusting those with calcium. If you have a UVB light, you can just do calcium without D3. And if you don't have a UVB light, then you should be doing calcium with D3. And the reason it's really important is because our commercially prepared bugs are high in phosphorus, which leach calcium from your animal as they digest it. And so by providing the calcium with the bug, you are preventing a leaching of calcium. So one of the things that we see a lot in insectivores that are not crested geckos is metabolic bone disease because they aren't getting enough calcium and people don't know how to supplement. And in this case, it's really important that you are supplementing your bugs to make sure that your gecko has plenty of calcium. A high quality crested gecko diet is going to have that in there as well. So you do not need to add calcium to their diet in addition to the bug dusting your bugs. So overall, crested geckos are one of the easiest animals that you could take care of, and that makes them excellent for beginners. It's also, while there are a few confusing points as to whether or not you need heat or lighting, it is easier than most other reptiles, making them great for beginners, making them easy to take care of for long-term reptile keepers. So crested geckos get their name for their spikes, which are called crests. Their other common name is eyelash gecko because those spikes go up over their eyelashes. And another interesting fact is that if they lose their tail, it doesn't grow back. And they are forever what a lot of people call a frog butt. So here is Spike, and he is one of our males. He is a quad stripe because he's got these pins down there and the lines on the side. And he's also an empty back because there's no pattern in the middle of his back. And then he's an interesting, like olive base with orange markings. He has made some very beautiful babies. Anyway, crested gecko care is super easy, and that makes it a wonderful animal for beginners and experienced keepers alike. I hope you had a wonderful day. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I would love it if you took a minute to subscribe and to like the video, to leave a comment. And there's more great content coming up right now. We also have our egg counter, which is ticking up. And we are up to 10 eggs in the 10 gecko eggs. We have 5 crested geckos and 5 gargoyle geckos and 15 corn snake eggs. So it's the start of an exciting season. Have that wonderful day.